Hello YouTube. Today we're going to examine the concept of human races. This is a very emotive topic. It's one of the more contentious topics in philosophy and science, but I'll do my best to present the arguments fairly. Now, these days there are, broadly speaking, three views of race. First, there is what we might call racial naturalism. This is probably the common sense view of race. On this view, race exists and is a biological phenomenon. We can group humans into different categories on the basis of biological racial differences. So racial naturalism involves four claims. First, race is inherited. So you are the same race as your parents. Or if your parents were two different races, then you are mixed race to one degree or another. The point here is that race is something that has a genetic basis. Second, race is marked by certain bodily characteristics. For instance, skin colour, hair type, skull structure, and so on. So, in general, we can identify a person's race just by looking at them. Third, racial differences are tied to certain geographical locations. In particular, they're kind of continent-wide. They cluster over the space of continents. So race isn't a local phenomenon, right? A race doesn't. You don't have like a race of a particular town or a particular city. Race is a very large grouping of humanity. There are maybe 5 or 6 races overall, not thousands or millions. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, race marks off certain underlying physical and perhaps mental properties. There's more to race than mere surface features such as skin colour. To put it in philosophical terms, races are natural kinds. Now, of course, this is not to say that races have fixed or immutable or essential properties. Since the Darwinian Revolution, we've known that no biological populations are fixed or immutable. Any population can change. Instead, the most plausible account of natural kinds for biological populations is what's known as the homeostatic property cluster account, which is a rather cumbersome name for a very simple idea. The idea is just that natural kinds are groups of entities that share certain stable properties. So spiders have certain common properties. They have 8 legs, they have 2 tagmata, they prey on other organisms, they have fangs that inject venom, they spin webs, and so on. The point is that since spiders share these common properties, then if you know that something is a spider, this allows you to predict, to make a reasonably good prediction about other properties it has. So if we know that an organism is a spider, we know it probably has 8 legs. If we know an organism is a spider, we know it probably spins webs. Now, it might not have 8 legs and it might not spin webs for various reasons. Some spiders don't. And in the future, spiders may well evolve so that they only have 6 legs. But, you get the point. Spiders have these sort of stable properties that are common to most spiders. Well, so a similar idea applies in the case of race, right? Races are large groups of humans that share certain stable properties. And these properties arise due to genetic differences. So once we know that somebody is of a particular race, this allows you to make a prediction, and in most cases the prediction will be correct, about a number of other important properties that they have. One example of this might be that many people argue that we can use race in medicine. A few years ago, the FDA approved a drug called Bidil for use specifically among African American heart failure patients. So Bidil what the argument is that Bidil worked among African Americans, but not among other races. And it appears that the reason for this is that African Americans tend to have lower levels of nitric oxide in the blood than people with Caucasian ancestry. And Bidil is more effective among those with lower levels of nitric oxide. More controversially, a few people have argued that there might be links between race and cognitive abilities. So some races are, on average, more intelligent than others, or more disposed to violent behaviour than others. And again, this is due to genetic differences between the races. This kind of view tends to be pretty unpopular even among racial naturalists, but the point here is that racial naturalists think that races track significant physical and perhaps even psychological properties. So the second view is racial eliminativism. Eliminativists argue that there are no races in the sense just discussed. In other words, race is not a legitimate biological category. Now, of course, the eliminativist doesn't deny that humans can be divided up along the lines of traditional racial classifications. There are obviously differences in skin colour, and these differences have broadly continental patterns. The eliminativist simply claims that these differences are of no biological significance. There are many other equally legitimate ways to divide up humanity. For instance, here is a map of the distribution of the allele for the blood type A. This is not remotely concordant with the distribution of skin colour, right? So in this case, we have to group together people in the north of Britain, people in Africa, people in this part of Russia, people in this part of like North America or Canada. And obviously, we wouldn't see this as a biologically significant grouping. Well, just as we don't see humans of different blood types as comprising different races, we shouldn't see humans of different skin colour or different geographical ancestry as comprising different races either. So the eliminativist says. So the eliminativist says that there are no biological races, and she then concludes from this that races simply don't exist. There are no human races, period. There are many differences between different populations of humans, but none of these support the division of humans into races. The concept of race should be jettisoned, should be done away with. So the racial eliminativist thinks that because race is not a legitimate biological category, there just are no races. A third option is racial constructivism. The constructivist agrees with the eliminativist that there's no biological support for the notion of race. However, the constructivist says that race nevertheless exists, and it exists as a result of the decisions and practices of human culture. So race refers not to populations grouped by biology, but to populations grouped by social practices and classifications. Society separates people into racial categories, and as a result of social discrimination, the people in different categories will experience significant differences in their lives. They will experience differences in resource access, in opportunities, in well-being, and so on. Even in an entirely egalitarian society where there is no discrimination, racial classification will still affect the self-identity of people who are classified. So somebody who's classified as a particular race may come to see themselves as being part of a minority with certain political goals. They may form communities with other people who are classified the same way, hence they have a common experience, and so on. So we might, on this view, compare race to socioeconomic class. Class is not biological, it's not genetic, but it has significant consequences. It's very clear that people can in fact be separated into different classes, and this leads to significant differences in their lives. Class is real. It's a real thing. So similarly then, race, according to the constructivist, is biologically a myth, but it's socially real. Now, notice that on this view we can still treat races as homeostatic property clusters, right? People categorised as black are, for example, more likely to be turned down when applying for jobs, they're more likely to fail in school, they're more likely to be targeted by police for crimes, they're likely to have lower life expectancies. So knowing that a person is black allows us to make a better than chance prediction about other aspects of their lives. Now, of course, in this case, this is not a result of genetic differences, this is a result of social discrimination. But still, that kind of category still exists, it's still real. And according to the constructivist, one of the main problems with adopting the eliminativist view of race is that if we say that races simply don't exist, and if we then ignore race, we will end up ignoring racial discrimination, which is of course, very real and has very bad consequences. Notice as well that on racial constructivism, race is something that will be different in different societies. For example, Alan Templeton in Biological Races in Humans notes that people who consider themselves white in Brazil will be considered black in the United States. Many Brazilian whites have more African ancestry than people who are considered black in the United States. Another example is that the United States once adopted the so-called one-drop rule, according to which if you had just one black ancestor, then this made you black. Of course, these days, blackness is determined either by the colour of your skin or just by having mostly black ancestors. Final example is that Jews and the Irish are now considered white, but they once were not. So for the racial constructivist, claims about race will always be limited to a particular time and place. In the past, Irish people really were not part of the white race. They became whites only when beliefs changed. So this is the sort of general views that are on the table in the debate about race. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm not really going to distinguish between the eliminativist and constructivist positions. The question I'm interested in is whether races exist biologically. So we will have a look at some of those arguments. From my own reading of the literature, I think the general consensus among biologists, anthropologists, philosophers and so on is against racial naturalism. There are certainly some people who still defend racial naturalism, but my impression is that the consensus is against it. Now, race is, it's quite an intuitive idea, so, why, right? Why should we think that race is not biologically real? Well, there are a number of arguments that have been proposed. First of all, there is the argument that any distinctions between races are arbitrary because there are no clear boundaries between human populations, but only gradations. To put it in technical biological terms, biologists would say that human variation is clinal, which basically means that the variation occurs on a continuous gradient rather than exhibiting discrete steps. I mean, this is obviously the case for racial markers like skin colour. There are populations of every shade of skin. There's no point at which we can say, okay, here's the white people, and then there's the black people, and there's a discrete step. Instead, it shades from one to the other, and that's true for human variation in general. Whatever trait you pick, you will find these gradual clinal variations, not discrete steps, and this means that any place we try to draw the line between races is going to be arbitrary, and so this is supposed to be a problem for the racial naturalist. Now, personally, I think this is a pretty weak argument. There's no precise line between being bald and not being bald, but we can still distinguish the two. There is no precise line between the rich, the middle class, and the poor, but again, we can still distinguish these categories. And that has those being in a different category there still has a substantial effect on people's lives. It matters whether you're rich or poor. Even if there isn't a strict line between them. So the mere fact that there's no clear line between biological categories doesn't entail that there are no biological categories. So even if human variation is clinal, it may still be the case that variation clusters around different continents, and that will allow us to distinguish the traditional races. Indeed, clinal variation can lead not just to different sort of races, but to completely different species. We can find this with what are known as ring species. A classic example concerns various species of gull that live around the Arctic Circle. Basically, population 1 and population 2 are slightly different. They're assigned to a different subspecies, but they're sufficiently similar to each other that they frequently interbreed. The same is the case for populations 2 and 3, and for populations 3 and 4, and so on. However, by the time we get to population 7, this is so different from population 1 that they don't interbreed. They have to be considered, at the very least, you have to consider them different subspecies, and maybe even different species. Actually, I should note that this particular example, more recent evidence seems to suggest it might be false, or at least simplified, but it makes the point, right? Clinal variation does not entail that we can't distinguish separate groups. Right, a second argument against racial naturalism appeals to the fact that humans are a very young species. Now, traditionally, there were two models of human evolution. One model, known as the multi-regional model, diagrammed here, proposes that Homo erectus left Africa over 1 million years ago, and they populated the world, and then these populations gave rise to modern humans. There was interbreeding between the populations, but to a large extent they remained separate. So you can see that Homo erectus left Africa, and then they sort of largely separately evolved into modern humans, and of course that would seem to support the notion of race, because we have different human populations over different continents with a very different evolutionary history. The alternative model is the out of Africa model. On this model, modern humans evolved somewhere in East Africa around 100 to 150,000 years ago. They then migrated out of Africa about 60,000 years ago, and they displaced the descendants of Homo erectus, as shown in this diagram. So modern humans, when they left Africa, the descendants of Homo erectus were then just removed. They were displaced. Now, until recently, the out of Africa model was the scientific consensus, and this was largely due to the determination of the date of a person called Mitochondrial Eve. Mitochondrial Eve is the matrilineal most recent common ancestor of all humans. This is the woman from which all humans descend through their mothers. So in other words, every human can trace back their mother, and then her mother, and then her mother, and her mother, and so on, to converge on one woman. We can determine who this is because mitochondrial DNA is inherited solely from the mother. Now, it turns out that Mitochondrial Eve lived in Africa somewhere between 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, and that would seem to support the out of Africa model. We all share an ancestor only 100,000 to 200,000 years old, who was from Africa. So if the multi-regional model were correct, we would expect that Mitochondrial Eve should be much older, maybe over a million years old. But that's not what we find. So this argument against racial naturalism assumes the out of Africa hypothesis. If humans left Africa about 60,000 years ago, then this is the point at which races would have started developing. But in evolutionary terms, 60,000 years is no time at all. So we should be sceptical of biological races because there simply hasn't been enough time for substantial biological differences between continental populations to evolve. Now, I should note that recent evidence on human evolution has complicated the story somewhat. We now think that rather than simply displacing the earlier hominin populations, ancestral humans may have actually interbred with them. There appears to be Neanderthal DNA in all populations other than those native to sub-Saharan Africa. So an immediate objection to this argument is that, it depends on an out-of-date theory of human evolution. If there were significant differences between the earlier hominin populations, and if ancestral humans interbred with them after leaving Africa, then the ancestral humans may have taken on some of those differences. However, I think the more important objection to this argument is that actually evolution can be rapid. 60,000 years is more than enough time for significant differences to emerge. Some of the classic examples of natural selection show how fast evolution can be. Consider Kettlewell's peppered moths. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, moths were generally white-bodied, and this provided camouflage against tree trunks which were covered with lichens, and hence they were pale or white in colour. However, the Industrial Revolution caused a lot of pollution, particularly soot, which covered the trees and turned the trunks black. Now, within just a few generations, peppered moths had become mostly black-bodied, so that didn't take very long. Now, another very important process in evolution is genetic drift. Genetic drift is essentially change in allele frequencies due to sampling errors. I should note that alleles are alternative forms of a gene. So you might have a gene that codes for eye colour. One allele might code for brown eyes, another allele codes for blue eyes. So alleles are alternative forms of a gene. Actually, eye colour is influenced by more than one gene, but you get the point. So anyway, let's say you have an urn containing 1,000 balls, 500 red balls, 500 green balls. Now suppose you're told to take out at random half the balls. Well, you'll probably end up with about a 50-50 split of red and green, about 250 red and 250 green. But you probably won't have exactly that number. It'll be more like 240 red, 260 green. In other words, there will be some sampling error. The ratio of colours won't exactly match the original ratio. Now, the sampling error is likely to be greater the lower the number of the balls you sample. Suppose you only take out 10 balls. Well, there's a good chance that you'll end up with, for example, 8 red balls and 2 green balls. That would not be a surprising result. Well, in this case, the proportion of red to green balls has substantially changed. So the basic point is that any sample can have a sampling error. And the sampling error is likely to be worse the smaller the sample is. And exactly the same is true for alleles in a population of organisms. Suppose you have a population of butterflies. There's an allele that codes for red wings, an allele that codes for green wings, and this is currently split exactly 50-50. Well, in a large population, assuming that neither allele has a selective advantage, the ratio will probably be about the same the next generation. But if you take a very small sample of that population, the ratio can change significantly just by chance. If you just taking a random sample, if you take 10 of the butterflies, well, the ratio might just substantially change just by chance, just as in the case of the urn and the balls. An example of this, noted by Kenan Malik in his book Strange Fruit, is that the Afrikaners of South Africa descend primarily from one boatload of Dutch immigrants in the 1600s. One of these immigrants carried the gene for Huntington's disease. And for that reason, Huntington's disease is now far more common among Afrikaners than it is among other populations. So in that case, just by chance, one of these immigrants had Huntington's disease, and because it was a very small population, it's just one boatload of people, that meant that a lot of the ancestors also developed Huntington's disease. It's now in the population at a far higher rate than is the norm. Now, when humans left Africa and populated the world, they probably did so in relatively small bands of migrants. So genetic drift will probably have led to some very rapid changes in allele frequencies in different populations. Now, with this in mind, the fact that humanity is a young species is irrelevant. Tens of thousands of years is more than enough time for human subspecies to split off and differentiate. Indeed, some racial naturalists have argued that given the fact that human populations are constantly interbreeding, then with longer time we should expect any significant genetic differences to be mixed out. So actually the youth of humanity is an argument for racial naturalism, not an argument against it. Since humans are a young species, there hasn't been enough time for global interbreeding to swamp the effects of the initial genetic drift that occurred when these small bands of migrants left Africa. So you can see that actually this argument can go either way. So, a third argument, also appealing to evolutionary history, is that human evolution has been marked by extensive gene flow between populations. Gene flow just refers to the transfer of genes from one population to another as a result of migration and interbreeding. Essentially, the point here is that human populations are constantly interbreeding. So, genes which are localized to one population don't stay in that population for long. They soon spread out and mix with all others. So no populations have been separate for a significant period of time. Another way to put it is that when humanity evolves as a single lineage, there are no sort of independent human lineages. There are no lineages of humans evolving independently. We evolve as a single group, and according to this argument, that means there are no grounds for dividing humans into races. Now, a first objection to this argument is that there can still be significant genetic differentiation even when there is significant gene flow. Massimo Pigliucci and Jonathan Kaplan, in their article on the biological concept of race, give the example of the Hawaiian fly species Drosophila mercatorum. In this species, populations in Hawaii, they demonstrate substantial differences in terms of their adaptation to local conditions, and yet these populations frequently interbreed, so there is significant gene flow between them. So just because there's gene flow, there can still be genetic differentiation as a result of selective pressures. Now, given that humans on different continents will have been subjected to different environmental pressures, selection may well have preserved differences even with significant gene flow. Second, and perhaps more importantly, gene flow in human populations has often been limited, primarily due to geography. There was much more interbreeding between the people who lived in what are now France and Germany than between the people who lived in what are now Spain and Morocco, simply because Spain and Morocco are separated by several kilometres of water. So while it's true that human populations tend to interbreed whenever they meet, it's also the case that geographical barriers will keep populations largely separate. And of course this would explain the continental distribution of races. Just take a look at a map, right? I mean, Africa is, just in geographical terms, it's split off from Europe and Asia. Right? Same for the Americas. They are geographically separated by water, for instance, which will kind of keep the people in these different continents largely separate. I mean, they do meet. People do spread around the world, but there's going to be a barrier there to gene flow. Luigi Luca Cavilli Sforza, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly there, but never mind. He's done a lot of work on the history of human migrations, and it seems that human populations have been independent enough that it's possible to reconstruct our evolutionary history. Here's a tree that represents some of the results. This represents how closely modern populations are in terms of ancestry and descent. So humans, as we mentioned, evolved maybe 100 to 150,000 years ago. The first split separates the Africans from the other populations. Another split divides the Pacific Southeast Asians from everybody else. Further split separates the Asians and the Amerindians from the European and non-European Caucasoids, and so on. I mean, you can see this yourself, and so we can track these human migrations, and human populations, although they do mix, they have remained somewhat separate. So we can group them. Those I will continue with this in the next video. Those were some arguments. I wouldn't say that they are conclusive arguments against racial naturalism, but I think that the main arguments against racial naturalism we will look at in the next video. But those were some arguments that have been proposed. I'll see you soon. Goodbye.